Leadership diagnostic is a method for dealing with exceptions. In most organizations, the routine work that gets done is the product of the outcome of a system. In other words, it is the product of a norm. And the problem with exceptions is that these are things that happen that are outside of the norm. And in most instances, management deals with exceptions from the point of view of wanting to gain control over them. And very often this doesn't actually help people understand how people in the hierarchy actually contributed to the problem. So this leadership diagnostic is a way of working out how people in the line contributed to any given exception or problem. The method is based on an understanding that there's fundamentally a difference between what one gets and what one gives. And this difference, first of all, relates to how we understand the relationship between cause and effect. Cause is what you do, it's what sits in your hands. The effect is what sits outside of your hands. It happens over a period of time. That therefore means it's also consistent with the distinction between outcome and process. Process is concerned with what you do, and outcome is concerned with the effect over time. And that therefore means you can describe contribution as what you do and result as the effect over time. Now, we've come to use this distinction to understand the difference between responsibility and accountability. Our view is that accountability of the two words is the harder word. I mean, this is the thing you will carry consequences for. Whereas responsibility is a bigger kind of idea that really describes an area that you have a custodial sort of charge over. So we would add to our distinction so far the idea that accountability is concerned with what sits in your own hands, and responsibility is concerned with the outcome or the results that you get over a period of time. Our view, therefore, is that fundamentally what you get from the world is not actually in your control. It doesn't sit in your hands. But what sits in your hands, what you have control over, is what you give to the world. It is the causal bits, the process bits, the contribution you make, that is your accountability. Now, using this insight on a hypothetical sort of three-level hierarchy, let us say, for instance, we're dealing with a worker, and the worker produces a result, that's true, on the basis of what the worker does, but the result doesn't happen by magic. The worker does certain things to produce that result. He does a certain task to stand it. And using the distinction we've just alluded to, we would say that the result is the worker's responsibility. It's what he gets. But the worker's accountability is to do the job that he's supposed to do to stand it. Let's assume this worker reports to a supervisor or an overseer. And the first question is, well, is there a result that's concerned with what the overseer does? And yes, there normally would be, and that result would be a bigger one than the worker's result because it will be a cumulative result of all the workers in his area. The issue is, what does the overseer himself give with regard to those results? And first of all, the overseer might be doing certain tasks himself. I mean, he might be doing a report for his boss. He might be sitting in on a job grading committee, all sorts of tasks he might be doing himself. But the rest of what he does gets delivered for him through the worker. And the question is, what's the overseer's contribution with regard to what gets done through the worker? And clearly, that contribution is to care for the worker, to look after the worker, and to give the worker the means, the ability, and the accountability to do what the worker is required to do. So the overseer's contribution, the overseer's accountability is to do certain tasks himself and to provide the worker with care, means, and ability and accountability. The result is the overseer's responsibility. And so then we obviously would have a similar logic when we examine the boss. The boss also produces a result. Some of the tasks that the boss gives or does are actually she would do herself. Then, similarly to the overseer, there might be sort of a longer term plan that she would have to present to her board or whatever. But the rest of what she does gets delivered through the overseer. Her contribution with regard to what gets delivered through the overseer is to care for the overseer, to give him the means, the ability, and the accountability to do what's required of him. So we could therefore say that the boss's accountability is to do some tasks and to provide care, means, ability, and accountability for the overseer, and the boss's responsibility is to achieve a result. So let's assume there's been some result that's really completely out of whack, and let's assume that the reason for that being the case is that the worker didn't do certain things to standard. Now, in most organizations, the boss's response to this would be just make damn sure this never happens again, which is really a control response. And this is clearly an inappropriate way for the boss to deal with this, because the boss has to recognize that she herself has made a contribution to this problem. So the question is, well, what is the boss's contribution? And actually, you cannot work out what the boss's contribution to the particular problem was until you've worked out what the overseer's contribution was. And you cannot work out how the overseer contributed to the problem until you've worked out how the worker contributed to the problem. So you actually need to establish how each level in the hierarchy contributes to a problem bottom up. So if we applied it to this instance, let's assume that the reason why the worker didn't do what's required of him because he was just plain careless. And so therefore, what needs to happen is that the overseer should discipline the worker. But let's assume the overseer doesn't know how to discipline the worker. Well, then what the boss should do is basically train the overseer to be able to discipline. So if we constructed this problem bottom up, we would then notice then that how each person contributed to this issue that went wrong is that, first of all, the worker was careless. Secondly, the overseer didn't hold the worker accountable. And thirdly, the boss's contribution was not to enable the overseer to discipline the worker. The critical point about this is for the boss to do anything other than to enable the overseer to discipline, in this instance, would actually be to fix the problem cosmetically. It's not good enough for her to intervene, to impose a control mechanism just to get the worker to do the thing right. So, we have this leadership diagnostic methodology that actually is concerned with unpacking a problem like this.